Good evening, everybody. I'm going to start our lesson this morning in some text. So if you'd open in your New Testaments to the book of Hebrews, we're going to be there. Lesser familiar text in Hebrews 11. Nobody knows about that, right? Just kidding, everybody knows about that. Even if you only know one thing about Hebrews, you know about Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11, we'll start in verse 32 and work our way down to verse 40. So Hebrews 11, 32 through 40. As the Hebrew writer starts to kind of wrap up this chapter, he says, "And what more shall I say? For time will fail me if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who by faith conquered kingdoms, performed acts of righteousness, obtained promises, the power of fire, escaped the edge of weakness, were made strong, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Others were tortured, not accepting their release, so that they may obtain a better resurrection. And others experienced mockings and scourgings, yes, also chains, imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, they were put to death with the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, ill-treated, men of whom the world is not worthy, wandering in deserts and mountains and caves and holes in the ground. And all these, having gained approval through their faith, did not receive what was promised, because God had provided something better for us, so that apart from us, they would not be made perfect." I'm going to probably end on this thought, or near this thought, but I wanted to maybe just start by planting a seed there. Have you ever been kind of mystified by verse 39 and 40? All these having gained approval through their faith, which seems like enough, doesn't it? It says, though, that they did not receive what was promised because God had provided something better for us. I'm not much in the guilt game. As a preacher, I don't like doing that. I don't think that's the right way to motivate people. I think if we're guilty of something, we can just be guilty of it and be accountable to God for that. I don't have to make you feel that way. But that kind of makes me feel guilty, honestly. Like I read that text and I think, wow, that's messed up. These are amazing people that are being talked about in this chapter. And yet God says that he had provided something better from us. And then he goes on and he says something I don't know that I totally even understand, to be honest with you. He says, so that apart from us, they would not be made perfect. Whoa, what? Man, talk about pressure, right? I mean, if you don't feel pressure from that, I don't know what's going to make you feel pressure. That's a huge statement. And I think at the very least, what it does is it starts us off with a thought that is somewhere around the idea that our lives matter. Like our lives mean something as Christians. It's real important that we understand who we are and that we live lives that are worthy of what has been offered on our behalf. I don't think that any Christian anywhere has the right to say that their life doesn't mean enough. Just based on that last passage and being mentioned in company with these people should be enough. Should be enough for us to realize, man, whatever this passage is teaching, it requires a whole lot of us. It requires a whole lot of us. So I wanted to start with that thought. I don't know if you've ever thought about those two verses, but those verses kind of shaped me a little bit. But if I were to ask you, let's kind of work back up towards the top of our reading tonight. If I were to ask you, what is this piece of text about? And we can extend that out to the whole 11th chapter. If I was going to ask you just, hey, tell me what you would tell somebody if they asked you, what is Hebrews 11 about? I think I know what the answer is. And it's not a trick. I'm not setting a trap here. Preachers like doing that. Good preachers set traps, but I'm not setting a trap. I'm not a good preacher, so I'm not setting a trap. You would say, well, this text is about faith. That's what we call it, right? We call it the faith chapter. Some people that are really witty say things like, well, this is the Hall of Faith. Get it? The Hall of Faith, like the Hall of Fame, but not. It's the Hall of Faith. I wouldn't say that because that's cheesy, and I'm not a cheesy preacher. So, I'm just kidding. That insults somebody, I'm sure, in the room. I didn't mean to. We would say, obviously, this is about faith, and that's right. That's not a trap. That's not a test. I mean, it's just easy to answer that question. If the follow-up question was, faith in who? That's also, I think, kind of an obvious answer, isn't it? I think you could answer it a couple different ways, but the answer would be the same. Faith in God. Is that right? I think it's right. Faith in Jesus. Yep. I think that's right too. We're pretty much talking about the same guy there. But we would say this is about faith in a person. This is not just about faith in general. We all have faith. Everybody has faith. Everybody walking this planet and has ever walked this planet has faith in something. We're constructed in such a way that we can't not have faith. Everybody is putting their trust in something, in some ideology, right? In some set of theories, and some set of worldview, person view, self view, other view. Everybody is walking this planet by faith. But this is a text about putting our faith in God. This is about putting our faith in Jesus. I want to suggest tonight, as we just kind of start talking about this text and start unpacking it, that there's an additional thought here that is maybe as important to really understanding what the Hebrew writer is trying to communicate, that is about something we have to have, something that we have to possess. I'm not going to give that to you right away, but I'm going to say this lesson is really a pretty simple lesson in that it's number one about identifying what that thing is. What is it that the Hebrew writer is saying that we must have? Along with faith, right? And maybe in partnership with faith. I don't want to put one above the other because then I'm challenging you to ruin the text. I don't want to ruin the text for you. This is the faith chapter. I'm not going to suggest it's anything else. But there's something along with faith that is being brought up, I think, alongside of it at least, and saying this is equally important. And we have to have it if we're going to be Christians and we're going to be successful Christians. So we have to, number one, identify what it is, and we have to figure out how to get that. Like, how does that become, how does that thing, whatever it is, whatever we identify here, how do we achieve that? So it's a simple lesson, real simple. What is it, and how do we get it? Okay, that's what we're going to talk about just for a few minutes here. So let's talk about that. If you go back up to the top of our reading, verse 32, I think we as people really like verse 32 to 35. That would be my guess. If I had to say, pick out of the reading tonight, what are some of your favorite verses? I think it would be something along the lines of, what shall I say? Right? It's kind of dramatic. For time will fail me if I tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah and David and Samuel and the prophets, who by faith did amazing things. By faith did amazing things. I would tend to think that this is the piece of this text that resonates the most with us. That as we read this, we're like, yes, this is why I love Hebrews 11. I love Hebrews 11 because Hebrews 11 says in verse 34 that all of these people shared something in common that we as humans all love. And that is that they were made strong out of weakness. You know what? That's the biblical way of saying they were the underdogs, right? All these people were underdog stories. In some part of their life, there was something happened to them that was the unexpected. And as a matter of fact, in all of these people's lives, they were at times, I think specifically the times that are being talked about here, they were all but dead. And through faith, they came back. They were zeros, and they became heroes. And we love stories like that. We want to, as a matter of fact, we want to identify with stories like that. We want to be those people. Those people are heroic to us for a reason, because we aspire to be like them. And I'll just suggest that's obviously not a religious thing, right? Not entirely. One of my favorite movies of all time, Rudy. Yeah, I'm aging myself. But I like sports movies, and that's an old sports movie. It's about this kid that's about this tall, and has zero athletic ability. And his dream is to play for Notre Dame, if you've never seen the movie before. And he has a struggle. He has a struggle getting in on the Notre Dame football team. And he ends up being, by just sheer will, part of the practice squad. And man, he gives everything. This kid the movie's really hard to watch at times because he just gets beat up at every scene, at every turn. He's just trying so hard and everything's against him. And the very end of the movie is this final game that Notre Dame has this particular season, and he gets to suit up for one game. And they send him in for one play at the end of the game. And everybody in the stadium, do you remember? Everybody in the stadium. Rudy. I mean, it's just, and I'm crying in my recliner, and my family's looking at me like they couldn't be any more disappointed in me because I'm crying at another Rudy. But it's just so awe-inspiring. We love stories like that, and Rudy's one of a million. Stories that have been told throughout history, or movies that have been made recently about the underdog. We love the story of the underdog, and all of these people are that way. The Hebrew writer talks about how by faith, the mouths of lions were shut. Who's that? You know who that is? That's Daniel. Daniel's tossed into a lion's den, and the door is shut. And everybody in Daniel's world thinks Daniel's dead. And the next morning, that den gets opened up, and there he is, alive and well, snuggling up with the lions. And you get to hear, Daniel, just like Rudy, right? He's the underdog that made his way out of the lion's den, quenched the power of fire. Who's that? We know who that is. It's actually 3 guys. Another shout out to Mike's 3 favorite guys. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Taken into the furnace, thrown in. Everybody standing there that's there to worship that golden idol thinks what? Those dudes are, I almost said they're toast. That would be terrible. Those guys are dead. There's no way they're getting out. They're dead. And yet they see them walking around the fire. There's another one, looks like the Son of God, the image of God, and they're walking around the fire together, and out they come. They're not even smoking, right? I mean, it's amazing. Their clothes are still on. They didn't send you off. David is mentioned here, I think at least by implication. He lived in a cave. He had all of the focus of an entire kingdom placed on him, trying to hunt him down and kill him. And yet, he survived. I'm sure there were nights that Saul thought, tonight's the night, I'm going to get that guy. There's no way that he's going to escape my grasp again. And yet, David pulls through. Talks about women receiving back their dead. That's the widow of Zarephath and the Shunammite woman who received back their sons through resurrection. And you think, well, they were dead. they weren't all but dead. They were dead. And you can go on in this text. Those first couple verses, 32 to 35, we love them. And rightfully so. Rightfully so. As people of faith, we should love those stories. Those are great stories, right? Because they tell us something. They tell us that it's the timeless story of Scripture. That if you're with God, nobody can defeat you. And who doesn't want to be a part of that? Who doesn't want to go through life with that level of confidence? Is there anybody here that thinks, no, I'll pass on that? I don't really care. I'm fine the way that I am. I don't need that kind of confidence in my life. That's just going to weigh me down. Nobody thinks that. Everybody sees that kind of confidence in somebody that has that kind of faith, knowing that no matter what situation they get in, God's going to see them through. And you're inspired by it. It is awe-inspiring to see people like that. I don't have that kind of faith all the time, maybe rarely. And maybe you're the same way. But when you're around somebody that is that way, you're like, man, that's amazing. It's almost miraculous. It's powerful, right? We love that part of the text. That is kind of a setup, just so you know. Because the text goes on. If you look at verse 35, starting in verse 35, in verse 35, it says, well, the second part of verse 35, and others. Oh, wish the Hebrew writer would have left that out. And others. Why did there have to be others? I like the first list. Why and others? Listen to what he says. And others were tortured. No, I don't like that. not accepting their release so that they might obtain a better resurrection. And others experienced mockings and floggings, chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were tempted. They were put to death by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented. Others. Nobody wants to read about the others. We want to read about the other verses that come before this, right? Others were tortured, not accepting their release. Can you imagine that? I mean, one part of that is like, oh, that would be terrible to be tortured. But what's said here is that they're tortured, not accepting their release. You know, a lot of scholars think that, and the other part of this, by the way, before I move on to that, the other part of that is important, so that they might obtain a better resurrection. Amen. Now, we're going to come back to that in a few minutes. But these others, many scholars believe that these others might be in reference to some writings, some events that were written about and accounted for between the Testaments, between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Some people believe, and it does seem to fit, that these were people whose events were recorded in the book of the second book of the Maccabees in chapter 7. Chapter 7 of the second book of the Maccabees tells a story of Antiochus Epiphanes, which, by the way, he was a Seleucid king, but that name means, get ready for this, God manifest. So it kind of gives you an idea of the mindset of this individual. A little bit of God complex, right? He actually named himself God manifest. And what he was doing is he was trying to force that reality on people that he would go and conquer. His troops or his armies would go and conquer. And one of those groups of people were the Jewish people. And so there was a campaign where he had gone and he had taken Jerusalem. And what he would do in order to try to force submission, it was really an ideological thing. He was just trying to get people to worship him as God. That's what his big thing was. And in an effort to force this ideology, what he would do commonly is he would take prominent women and he would take their children. And of course, in ancient times, if you're a prominent woman, you were a prominent woman because you had a lot of children. And even more so, you had a lot of sons, right? And so what Antiochus Epiphanes would do is he would go and he would find prominent women that were living in Jerusalem or the surrounding area, and he would round up all of her sons, and he would take them into the temple, and he would start at the oldest and work his way down to the youngest. And he would tell them that if they wanted to live, they had to eat pork in the temple. So you can imagine that did not go over well. The idea of eating an unclean animal inside the temple grounds, and even in a place where they weren't even supposed to stand, right? They weren't even supposed to be in the courtyard where all of this was taking place. And if they refused, he would start by cutting out their tongues. And if they refused even still, he would start lopping off limbs. And if they refused even then, he would disembowel them. And there's one particular story that is captured in Second Maccabees 7 about this prominent woman who had 6 sons. And he brought the woman in and the 6 children in, and he started on the oldest. And before he killed this one or cut his tongue out, he said, "You may kill us, but the King of the universe will raise us from the dead and give us eternal life because we have obeyed his laws." That's bravery, right? I mean, that's amazing that he did that. And you can see that even if that story is accurate, that the reason he did it is because he, like the Hebrew writer said, was looking for a better resurrection. One of the next sons in the line said, "God gave these to me," speaking of his limbs, "but his laws mean more to me than my hands, and I know God will give them back to me again." It was actually 7. I misspoke. I said 6. It was actually 7 sons. All 7 of the women's sons responded similarly, and they got down to the last son, the youngest son. And obviously, you can imagine the brokenness of this woman as this was taking place, and how that brokenness would have escalated as as Antiochus was working through these different children. But I wanted to read to you the actual account in 2 Maccabees 7 that is surrounding the last son. This is what is written down. I do not know how your life began in my womb, she would say. This is what she would say to her children. I was not the one who gave you life and breath and put together each part of your body. It was God who did it. God who created the universe, the human race, and all that exists. He is merciful, and he will give you back life and breath again, because you love his laws more than you love yourself. That's what she would say to each son as he was going up to face this trial. The account talks about how Antiochus at some point began to feel like the woman was mocking him personally. Again, he had a God complex, right? So this woman was mentioning God a lot as her children were being slaughtered in front of her and in front of the other brothers. And so it says, in this account, it says, Antiochus was sure that the mother was making fun of him, so he did his best to convince her youngest son to abandon the traditions of his ancestors. He promised not only to make the boy rich and famous, but to place him in a prominent position of authority and to give him the title Friend of the King, which was obviously significant. But the boy paid no attention to him, so Antiochus tried to persuade the boy's mother to talk to him into saving his life. And after much persuasion, she agreed to do so. Leaning over her son, she fooled the cruel tyrant by saying in her native language, "My son, have pity on me. Remember that I carried you in my womb for 9 months and nursed you for 3 years. I have taken care of you and looked after all of your needs up until the present day. So I urge you, my child, to look at the sky and the earth. Consider everything you see there and realize that God made it all from nothing, just as he made the human race. But do not be afraid of this butcher. Give up your life willingly and prove yourself worthy of your brothers, so that by God's mercy I may receive you back with them at the resurrection." Now, as the story goes, that's exactly what the youngest son did. So that day, that woman stood there and watched 7 of her children, the pride and joy of her life, and what was much more to a woman in those days. It was her life, it was her existence, it was her identity, her sons were. And she watched that cruel tyrant slaughter them mercilessly and encourage every single one of them to go to their death with the hope in their heart of the resurrection and the faith in God that he was merciful and loving and kind, and the fact that he had created them was proof that he was going to repay them rightfully for their allegiance to him. Now, to have this kind of faith, this is the thing I think that we're flushing out of this text at this point. To have this kind of faith, the thing that we need is another very popular biblical word, hope. We need to have hope. And we have to have, again, not the kind of, we know this is basic stuff. We need to not have the kind of hope that is the kind of hope we talk about, but the kind of hope that is sure, that is steadfast, the way that it was for those people that we just read about, where they knew to such an extent that they could stand before somebody with that kind of power, with that kind of resource, and with literally their lives in his hands, and with a steely-eyed look, tell them to get lost. Tell them to take a hike. That there was under no circumstances going to be a confession of his deity that day. Because they couldn't. Because they knew who the true deity was. They knew who the true deity was. And so the point that the Hebrew writer is trying to make to the readers there in the first century and to us is that in order for us to have this kind of faith, we also have to have this kind of hope. If you read chapter 11, you can't have that kind of faith unless you have that kind of hope. Those two things, they truly do walk hand in hand, and it's hard to tell which one is more important. I don't think that it would even serve us to try to speculate. That's how important both of them are. Now, all of the people that are in the first part of the list were brought from death to life, but the truth is, it doesn't always work that way, and that's kind of the power of the text when you put it together. You know, you could go through that list and talk about a lot of those people, but I'll just choose one, David. David was a great man. And there was a time when David was running from Saul and he was living in caves and his life was always on the line, that I'm sure he wondered, I wonder if I'm going to make it through this. I mean, I know God told me that I'm going to be king, but boy, it sure feels like the deck is stacked against me here. And there's times where I can't figure out how God's going to do it. I wonder if I'm really going to make it. But you know what? God did see David through. But you know who he didn't see through? Jonathan. David lived and Jonathan died. Now that's hard for us, isn't it? I have a friend who is also a preacher. His name is Seth. His son was born with a condition. I don't even know the name of the condition, but essentially almost all of his brain matter was tumor tissue. The fact that he was alive was kind of a miracle to doctors, and the doctors told him, like, hey, just hold your son and kiss your son, because he's not gonna make it out of the hospital. That kid lived for like 8 years, and it was a terrible life. It was a terrible life for that little boy. And it was a difficult life for Seth and his wife and their whole family. Every day having to deal with the difficulties that were associated with that boy's condition. It was like living hell for them. It was torture for them. And right around the same time, Fran and I had a child, our son. I mean, he had ear infections, but he was healthy. And our son's alive. Seth's son is dead. I don't know how to answer that. I don't know how to make sense of that. These are things that we really struggle with in life. We have friends whose wives die or husbands die, and ours don't. Or we're the ones who has a spouse that passes or a child that passes and somebody else's doesn't. And we look at that person and we say, well, that person's actually kind of greater in faith than I am. And I think an argument can be made that in some ways Jonathan had greater faith than David did. Jonathan was an extraordinary person of faith. He was an extraordinary follower of God. Can you imagine how difficult it would have been to turn on your own father the way that Jonathan had to in order to just do the right thing? But that's what Jonathan did, because he knew it was right. He knew God was right. He knew God's ways were right. And he stopped following his own dad, who we know he struggled with. He loved him. He didn't want it to be that way. I think there's some indicators that Saul was probably a pretty good dad. He was just a terrible king. And Jonathan was ripped to shreds inwardly over what Saul was doing. But Jonathan chose to follow God and help David instead of his own father. He's an extraordinary man, but Jonathan died. Jonathan got caught up in Saul's judgment and died, and David lived. And that doesn't seem fair to us. It doesn't seem right to us. We sometimes can't make sense of it. And oftentimes what we end up doing is we think that people that are saved have a better faith than we have or that other people have. But I think that you can see that that's not always the case. Remember what Daniel's friend said, what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said? They said, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. He said, look, regardless if God saves us or doesn't save us, it doesn't change things. It doesn't change things. That story could have been that they said that, they went into the furnace, and they were consumed immediately. Would we have looked at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and said they didn't have as good a faith? Daniel lived, they died, Daniel must have been better. But that's kind of what we do. Sometimes we look at this and we say, well, one had better faith than the other. And that's not warranted from Scripture. And that's what the Hebrew writer is saying. The Hebrew writer is suggesting something to us that's very difficult for us to swallow. And that is, you may be great in faith, but it doesn't mean that things are going to work out for you. You may be great in faith, but it doesn't mean that God's going to deliver you. He he may not. It depends on what his purpose is in that moment. But it's no guarantee. You may be strong, you may be stronger than anybody else, but it doesn't mean that you're going to be saved. The kind of faith that sees us through anything in life is not rooted in life-based salvation. It's not. And sometimes that's the way that we approach our faith. Is, man, I really believe God's going to get me through this. I don't think we should say things like that. We shouldn't say things like that. Because there's nowhere in Scripture where you can back that up. Right? Jonathan was great, but he's dead. Well, I guess now David's dead too. But we'll get to that in a second. But in their lifetime, Jonathan died and David didn't. And Jonathan was extraordinary, maybe in some ways that David wasn't. And sometimes we say, well, I believe that I have faith in God that he's going to get me through this situation. That's the wrong thing to say, based on Hebrews 11. He may or may not. The thing that we ought to say is, I have faith in God that no matter what happens in this life, God's got my back. Amen. Because there is a better resurrection. What is the better resurrection? It's better than the salvation that may or may not come to me in this life. He may rescue me from a den of lions. That is a resurrection, is it not? He may rescue me out of a fiery furnace. That is a resurrection, is it not? You are all but dead, but God brought you back to life. Some of those kids, like we said, of those two women, they were actually dead. They were resurrected. But it has nothing to do with why they did what God wanted them to do. Because they searched for a better resurrection. That's why they did. And again, of course, the point of that is everybody delivered in Hebrews 11 is dead. They're dead. David's not here to talk to us about all of his adventures with Saul. He's dead. Now, he's not truly dead, but he's dead. His body is dead. He's dust. Just like Jonathan. Those boys that were resurrected, the people that Jesus resurrected, Lazarus, we say, oh, wow, Jesus resurrected Lazarus. For what? To have a non-suffering life? No. Lazarus was resurrected back into a broken world. And don't you wonder the first time Lazarus got a really severe cold if he thought, oh, I kind of remember what it was like on the other side. And it was much better than this. I guess God knows what he's doing, but boy, I kind of miss over there. Everybody who's ever been resurrected, anybody who's ever been snatched from death and made to live, they all suffered and they all died. And so being a Christian is not about avoiding suffering, and faith is not about a system that keeps us away from having to deal with the curses of this life. It's about hope. That beyond this life, God is going to resurrect us. And because of that, we can give him everything. There's nothing that we have to keep back. There's nothing that we have to be afraid of. Nothing. Because in the end, he's going to give us an actual resurrection. Well, how do we get that? I mean, how do you get that kind of faith and that hope that's married to faith? How do you achieve that? The general idea of all of these people they're talking about in this whole chapter, even the stuff that we didn't read before it, is that they were able to conquer life through faith. In spite of the fact that they did not have what we have. That's why I emphasize so much those last couple verses. All of those people mastered life. They mastered life. Now, if I would have started in like an inspirational speech style tonight and said, what if I could tell you the secret of mastering life? How many of you wouldn't have perked up? You know what I'm talking about? Like, it doesn't matter what reversal you experience in life. I can give you the secret to never having that reversal overcome you. Now, I'm talking about the big ones. Financial ruin, the loss of a loved one, perpetual sickness. I'm talking about the big stuff, not the little stuff, like somebody ran into me, right, and dented my car. That makes for a bad day. I'm talking about reversals, the kind of stuff that changes the course of your life. that reverses what we would say would reverse your fortune. Things were going good until those type of events. If I would have started tonight and said, hey, I've got something for you, something that's going to make it to where those things don't conquer you. You know, I was recently, I don't know why this got, maybe it was an anniversary of it or something. Remember was it Sri Lanka where that really bad tsunami happened? Almost 20 years ago now, I think. And there's all the video of it. It's all from a resort where people are like just sitting there and all of a sudden the ocean disappears. And they're like, where'd the ocean go? And they found out real quick. The ocean came back, right? Sometimes reversals feel like that. You feel like you're in a tsunami. I mean, it just takes you. And it doesn't matter. I don't know if you've ever been caught up in a wave. You know, we live in San Diego, but it's funny how hardly any of us go in the ocean. That's weird. But have you ever been caught up in a wave and you just thought, I don't know if I'm going to make it out of this. I don't know if I'm going to. It's too powerful for me. There are reversals in life that feel like that when you're in them, right? You lose all your money. You lose your wife. You lose a child, right? You find out that somebody's betrayed you that you thought would never betray you. And you're kind of, the wind's knocked out of you and you think, I don't know if I've got what it takes to get through this. I don't know if I'm going to make it. I just don't know. All of these people were able to master life. They faced those reversals head on, steely-eyed, with great courage. Doesn't that sound appealing to you? Don't you want to be in a position in life to where it's not, I'm set up for life, but like I've set myself up, but no matter what happens, like I know nothing's going to get me. Man, that sounds good to me. Because I feel like my life is an emotional roller coaster a lot of times. And stuff happens to me, and I very quickly go from feeling totally in control to totally out of control. And I don't like that feeling. That's a terrible feeling. All these people face those things themselves, big things. And they were like life-changing reversals. And yet they mastered them. They mastered them. They didn't allow those circumstances to master them. Doesn't that sound good? Don't you want that? How do we get that? The answer to that is they believe that God was the God of the living and not the dead. That's what they believed. They believed that God was the God of the living and not the dead. And simply based on that, he would never desert them. Now that's powerful. These people face those types of reversals that way, with just that. But what the Hebrew writer is saying is, in a way that's not much different than us, other than one tiny thing that's not a tiny thing at all. It's actually a really huge thing. And that huge thing is, they didn't know that one day God would leave heaven and he would enter into the body of a human and he would live among us, and that he would allow his creation to murder him. And then, just about the time that the sinful creation, thought they got away with something, he would flip the door open and walk out. Talk about a cool scene, right? They didn't know that was going to happen. David didn't know that. I think he probably had some ideas. I think God probably fed him some stuff, right? Abraham probably had some stuff fed to him. But a lot of these people, they didn't have any of that. They didn't know. They didn't know the story of Jesus. They just knew that they served the God of the living. And they believed, based on the fact that he had made us, that he must have made us with good intentions and he would never leave us to just rot. Why would God do that? It doesn't make any sense. It's nonsensical. But we have something really in a way that's almost entirely different than that. We actually have the hindsight of looking back and saying, wait a second, I know God's not going to leave us. I know it for a fact. And I know that because I've seen it. Not me personally, I wasn't there. I'm not that old. But I have seen it. Humanity has seen it. And this really kind of brings into light the importance, I think, and what is becoming even more important in the world that we live in, the importance of things like apologetics. To just take a second and think about how historically factual the resurrection is, actually is, because that's what the Hebrew writer is talking about here. Now, I wasn't there. I didn't see it. But I can't explain logically that Paul tells the brother that 500 people saw Jesus after his resurrection. It's 1 Corinthians 15. And then has the audacity to say, and many of those people that saw him are still alive today. You know what Paul's doing? He's saying, go and ask. If you don't believe me, go and ask them. They're alive. You can look them up. Go find them. They're out there. More than 500 people saw him. And you can go find those people and you can talk to them. Not one, not two, because then you don't know if they're being, shysters or whatever. There's 500 people, many of whom still live today. So go talk to them. And then there's the fact that there's just not a good explanation for how countless Jews and Greeks that have every reason to deny the resurrection and have every inkling historically and theologically to deny the resurrection. The idea of a resurrected God just did not work in the favor of the Jews. And we know it certainly didn't work in the favor of the Greeks. Remember the Sermon on Mars Hill? As soon as Paul said that, they were like, you had us, and then you lost us. Because that doesn't work. That doesn't work with our construct, our way of thinking about things, the world, ourselves, and deities. So you had us, but then you lost us. These people who believed in Jesus had every reason to not believe in the resurrection. They had every motivation to not believe in the resurrection. And yet, countless Jews and Greeks were convicted that Jesus had stepped foot out of that grave. He had stepped foot out. Then Jesus presents himself to his disciples after the resurrection. And when he appears to them as someone who has holes in his hands and a hole in his side. This isn't a picture of a triumphant political figure. This is a picture of a slain commoner. And in his victorious state, he carries these holes in his wrists and in his side. And then his disciples, after seeing him, suffer the same fate. The same dudes who 50 days before, right, before they got all bold and started preaching about this stuff, were running away, terrified, self-preservation. All of them went to essentially the same fate. Some of them even unwilling to die the way that Jesus did, right? That's what tradition tells us, at least. How do you explain this stuff? The historical Jesus, the existence of Jesus, the fact that Jesus walked among us is pretty easy to prove, but it gets exponentially easier when the resurrection comes into play. The resurrection is everything. You've heard that before. Everything. And the Hebrew writer is working off of that premise. Just so you know, that's not like something that we've created in efforts to be apologetically strong, right? That everything hinges on the resurrection. The Hebrew writer is saying everything hinges on the resurrection. Your faith and your hope hinge on the fact that Jesus was a real man, lived a real life, suffered a real death, and really rose from the dead. People saw him, talked to him, ate with him, touched him. That was not something that got thought up. That was not urban legend. That was not myth. That was real. That actually took place. And because it took place, this is what the Hebrew writer is saying, we can look and say, if they can do it with piecing together some concepts about God's character through creation, then what is wrong with us if we can't suffer the same fate, knowing factually that Jesus Christ rose from the dead? What is wrong with us? How can we deny him when these people didn't have any of that? But the Hebrew writer does say again, the fact that he did and the fact that we do makes them complete. Another way of saying that is maybe for generations, maybe for hundreds of years, maybe for thousands of years, there were people that knew those stories and said, what a fool. What a fool that person would do that. What kind of fool would let her 7 sons die like that for words? What kind of fool would do that? And the Hebrew writer says, don't you understand that when you stand based on the resurrection of Jesus, the factual resurrection of Jesus, and you do the same thing, you tell the world they're wrong. They're wrong about those people, and they're wrong about you, and they're wrong about Jesus. And that's what the world needs to be told. The world doesn't need to be told, like C.S. Lewis, that they're just fine and dandy. That's what he said. The Great Commission is not that Jesus set us into the world to say, you're fine and dandy. You're not fine and dandy. None of us are fine and dandy. We all need the power of the resurrected Lord in our life. And we need to live consistently with it. Let me wrap up with this. 1 Timothy 3 and verse 14 says, I'm writing you these instructions so that if I am delayed, you will know how people ought to conduct themselves in God's household. Sorry, different translation I was quoting there. How one ought to conduct themselves in God's household, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and foundation of truth. Bet you never heard that passage before. It's almost as famous as Hebrews 11, right? The foundation of a building is the starting point, right? And that's profound. That everybody in this room, what we're being told tonight, is that the church is the foundation for God's truth in society today. That's pretty monumental, right? We are the keepers and the stewards of God's truth, the source of truth, which is God's word. That's amazing. That's a huge responsibility, is it not? Pretty good reason to not quit. Pretty good reason to not throw in the towel. But then Paul throws in this thing that's weird to us. He says, actually, first, that we're the pillars and the foundation. So for a long time, I tried to figure, what does that mean? Okay, there's a foundation, stuff's built on the foundation, and there's support, and the true support. Okay, I think I can make something out of that, right? Because as preachers, you feel obligated to do so. It wasn't until recently that I read that pillars were, of course, support systems for buildings, just like they are now, right? We don't necessarily use pillars, but we use framing, 2x4s, structural integrity. That's what that's all about. I'm not an engineer, but I think so. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think I am. Anyways, and that was true then. But if you were to walk into any ancient temple, the pillars that you would see first would not just be structural support. They would be ornate. They would have two purposes. They would be structural support, but they would also be decorative. And what you would find carved into these pillars is you would find the story of the God that you were about ready to go in and worship. That's what the pillars look like. You would see the story of the God that you were about ready to go in and worship. So if you didn't know who it was that you were going to go in and worship, you'd stop for a second and you would look at the pillars and you would try to understand the man-made story of that deity. So you knew who it was you were going into worship and why you were going into worship them and the things that you could ask them for and the things you couldn't ask them for based on who they were. It's interesting to me that Paul decides that I think he could say that the church is the pillar and support of the truth, right? And the Bible tells God's story. Well, he does kind of say that, but that's not actually what he says. He says the church possesses the truth, but we're the pillar, right? You know what that means? That means that when people look at us, this is why this is so important that we have this conversation that we're having tonight. It means when people look at us, what they're reading is God's story. We're the pillars. Now that's not a sentence. This is not Paul's style, constructed to make you feel better about yourself. God cares very little about how you feel about yourself. I'm sorry, that's just the truth. This is a text that is meant to convict us about the significance of our life and the importance of living our life by faith and hope in Jesus Christ. Because whether we realize it or not, when we go out into the world, we're walking temples and tabernacles. And our life is a temple that tells the story of our God so that people understand who he is. And if they ever decide to come and worship in his temple, that they know who it is that they're worshiping, who it is that they're serving. And so when we think about this text in Hebrews 11, what the Hebrew writer is trying to get us to understand, again, is the significance of your life. The significance of your life, the meaning of your life, the purpose of your life, the value of your life. And help you to understand that the decisions that you make each and every day, though you might just make them individual, really just about you, they're not about you. They're not. They're not about whether or not you get to heaven or not. That's not what your decisions are much bigger than that. Your decisions really determine whether or not the story of God perpetuates in our society. And whether or not people see him, whether or not people get to know him, whether or not ultimately, maybe even, that people come to worship him. And that will all be dependent upon your faith and the hope that you place in the resurrection of Jesus. We can look at these people in Hebrews 11, and it's just so apparent to us. It's so apparent the impact that they had on their world. They didn't know how that was going to turn out. They didn't know what kind of impact they were going to be, but they're forever immortalized in these passages, telling us that they changed the course of the world in some cases. And don't you understand what the Hebrew writer is trying to do is to get you identified with those people? To stop memorializing them and to start identifying with them. To understand that you are them and they are you if your faith and your hope is placed in Jesus Christ and his resurrection. So I hope we'll try to do a better job at that this week. I hope that's something that will stick in our minds and we'll remember every day in all of our decisions that we'll be mindful of the fact that we're not just Joe Schmo. We're someone important. God has made us that way. And he's counting on us to be who we are designed to be, who Jesus died for us to be. So go ahead and close it. We're doing an invitation song right now, right? Yes? Okay. So let's close up our Bibles. Let's open up our songbooks and let's sing the invitation song. And as we do, let's think deeply about ourselves and who we are and whether or not we're living the life that Jesus died for us to live. And if we're not, then let's make that right. Let's make it right. And if you need to make that right tonight, then make it right tonight. And if we can help you to do that, then let us help you. But whatever needs to be done, let it be done. Let it be done. Don't waste and don't turn your back and don't harden your heart. If you're not living the life that Jesus died for you to live, then you're just not living life. You're just not. So let us know how we can help you as together we stand and sing the invitation song.